Hi everyone, Shelley here. Welcome to the Commissioned Portrait Part 2, the Underpainting. While you watch the underpainting develop, I'm also going to be discussing a little bit further the commissioned portrait and some of the details that go with it. The first thing I did was I covered my canvas with a very thin layer of walnut oil alkyd. I chose walnut oil with alkyd so that it would dry more quickly. I'm working on a 24-inch by 24-inch square canvas, and I'm using a mixture of transparent oxide red and viridian green. You can see I have my computer monitor here to the right, and I have put in a simple grid over the entire image. Basically, I just divided the image in half, and then in a quarter, and then in a 3/4, both vertically and horizontally. Now, I'm going to be putting in a loose grid on the canvas as well. I'm putting down some paint, and I'm finding those same grid lines on my square canvas as I go. Another way to handle this, if you wanted some more solid grid lines down, is I could have put the underpainting down without the figures on it, just sort of a toning of the canvas with the same mixture of the transparent oxide red and the viridian green, and then let that dry. And then I could have drawn a grid with I like to use erasable color pencils, but you could also use a pencil right on top of the dried toned canvas, and then go ahead and go at your underpainting that way. But I feel these painted in grid lines are nice because they're super easy to cover up. I'm using a T-square to paint the grid lines across the canvas. It works great, keeps my lines straight. I'll get a little bit of paint on the metal part of it, but that's no problem. I'll just wipe it off with a paper towel when I'm finished making the grid lines. I really love that the clients chose to wear costumes as opposed to just regular everyday street clothes. It really lends itself to the enjoyment of the painting process. I want the end result to look almost as if this painting has existed for 100 years, let's say. Maybe it was painted originally in the 1800s, and these are the ancestors of my clients. Now, we know that it's not, but hopefully the end result could give the feeling or the idea that that's something that could have happened. So perhaps this portrait's hanging on the wall of the client's home. They're entertaining, guests come in, and maybe they think it is, initially something from, way back in the day. It's an old family heirloom, and they don't really see right away that it is a modern day version of the hosts that have invited them to their home. Now I'm going to be focusing on using my grid system in order to get the composition of the figures laid out. I'm not relying on the grid for the likeness that's that's going to come later on. What's going to happen is I'm going to put down the figures and get some of the bigger shapes in place. And once I feel that the figures are solid and the composition is exactly what I want it to be, then and only then will I begin to work on the likeness. And in order to get the likeness without a smaller grid system in place, I'm going to be relying on comparative measuring. So I went ahead and painted what I feel like is the size of the head that I want to see in my final portrait. Now that I have that, I'm going to be zooming in on the computer monitor to get the head size of the male subject to match exactly what I have on my canvas. I want to make sure that I write down and keep track that the zoom that I'm going to find on my computer monitor right now is something that I can return back to. I don't have to remember it. I'm going to write it down because I know I'm going to forget. So I'm going to be making sure that I have a little note in front of my monitor, so when I go in to work on it the next day, if I'm going to be working on that with one-to-one measuring, then I need to be at the correct zoom percentage on the monitor so everything is exactly the same as what you see on the canvas. This will allow me to work very easily with comparative measures. But before we get into any of the detail, I'm going to really take the time and line up my proportion tool against that vertical line going right through the center of his face almost, and find the left edge of the face, and then I'll find the right edge, and I can use that one vertical grid line to find pretty much almost everything I need for the male subject's head and shoulders. And when I get a little bit lower into the body and face, then I can use that horizontal grid line as well. But that center grid line is really all I need to find the shapes that I'm going to be laying down. I love using the proportion tool. It will stay as I move from the monitor. Once I find the distance to an object or part of the painting that I'm working on, as I move from the monitor to the painting and vice versa, the proportion tool stays put. I don't have to worry about moving or losing my measurement. You can do it with, let's say, a paintbrush, against your subject and mark the width with your thumb on the brush. But sometimes as we're moving back and forth, that can slip or change. This way, with the proportion tool, I know that I am always where I need to be. In the beginning of an underpainting such as this, especially a commission where I have to really nail the likeness, I do rely heavily on measuring with my proportion tool. And I measure often, and sometimes 2 and 3 times I'll measure the same distance to the same item, just to be sure. And a lot of times when I paint for the day, and if I come back the next day and I'm still working on the underpainting, I will begin with a series of rechecking the measurements. Can never be too careful. And the beauty of having the layer of walnut oil down, it keeps the paint wet for a lot of days. This actual underpainting stayed wet for 6 to 7 days. I could have worked on it for many days if I wanted to. Overall, the total time for this underpainting was 7.5 hours. I did take breaks, but basically I completed it in 1 day. Now, when I say I completed the underpainting in 1 day, that's just the actual paintbrush to canvas time. While the painting is drying, it's here in my studio, and as I'm in the studio working on other things or on the computer editing videos such as this one, I can stare at it, and I like to look at the painting on its own merit without being judged against the reference image. I want to make sure that it stands by itself, a good composition and a good value structure. Since there's no color involved just yet for the underpainting, I don't have to worry about that. I can separate things, divide and conquer, and make it a little bit more manageable by only having to really kind of think about the drawing first, and then values are second to me in an underpainting situation. Really, it's about the drawing. Take your time with underpaintings. This thing, like I said, stayed wet for like 6 days. If you needed to take all 6 days to correct and get the likeness, then that's what you do. You don't move away from your underpainting until you have nailed the drawing. Now you see I found the eyes and now I'm finding the eyebrows, but this is just a loose placement of these features. This isn't a solidified absolute, okay? It's like you got to get something down in order to make corrections and figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work. You can't know if something's right or wrong if there's nothing there to look at or compare to. I wanted to talk to you more about being approached by a client and they're asking you to paint in a style or in a direction that is not you. The worst thing that you can do as a portrait artist is try to emulate or copy another artist's style that's not yours. You want to be able to develop your portrait portfolio in a direction that suits you as the artist, that is a good example of your style of painting, the way that you do portraits. So if you come into the situation where the client's asking you for something you don't do, you have two choices, like I mentioned in part one, that you can refer them to an artist that you know that does paint that way, perhaps, or you can just simply and politely let them know that's just not something that you do. Okay, so the way that I'm moving paint around in this underpainting situation, it's kind of like pushing the paint. And anytime I wipe away or push paint to an edge of an area, it's going to lighten that plane. Now, if I want to keep something kind of in the middle value, I'm just going to let the background show through. But in areas where things are darker, then I'm going to need to apply some of the more darker, thicker paint that's got a little less medium in it. I'm not really adding any medium to my paint because there's already that thin layer of the walnut oil without getting it down on the canvas. So you don't need to add any extra. Things would get really way too slippery, I feel, if you added more medium on top of what's already there. So since I have an oil primed canvas, as opposed to a just simple gesso primed canvas, I'm really able to wipe back to pure white if I want to. Now, if you're doing it on a gesso primed canvas, it'll stain the canvas, the initial toned paint down, and that may be fine if you don't need to wipe back to pure white, which really I didn't have to here. It's nice that I know I can. I just wanted to point out that differing situation in case you're in a situation where you really do need to wipe back or move paint out of the underpainting and get to pure white where you began on the canvas initially. That can only be done on an oil primed canvas. Now, as I'm going through and putting in some of the larger body parts, I want to look not only at the measurements from the grid system, I want to look at the actual figure. I want to see where is that left shoulder compared horizontally to the right shoulder. And you may put up a little line or a white piece of paper or something so that you can see if they're exactly even or if one's higher or lower than the other one. But you always want to be kind of skimming your eyes through the entire portrait and looking at it as a whole, even though you're measuring and kind of zeroed in on smaller parts at a time. Now with this, I'm at actually 105% zoom on my computer monitor, and with that zoom level, I can't see the entire reference image. But that's fine. I don't need to see the entire reference image for what I'm doing. But if you wanted to have that as well, you could maybe have the entire reference image printed out, or you could have another drop-down window where you can view the reference image in its entirety. Now, when I was saying that you need to understand your style of portraiture, that doesn't mean you can't be creative with the look of your portraiture. So for instance, I have a couple different styles that I'm known for. I have one that's called the persona portrait, and that's a more modern style of portraiture that includes some of a person's personality type things in the background. And it can be a fun way. I think it works great with younger people, maybe even children. In that situation. But then I also do classical portraiture, just like you would see hanging in a university or in a doctor's office, something like that, that's more traditional. But then I also do fantasy or kind of like storybook style portraiture where you're maybe in this situation here mimicking something from the past that will usually have costumes involved. But then there's one other style that I do Actually, there's two more, but I do these extreme close-up style portraits as well, so that's something interesting. Works best with one subject, doesn't really work great for multiple subjects. And then the other one that I do is this Rockwellianized style portraiture. So what that is, it's I like to take a Norman Rockwell painting and use it as a kind of a jumping off point. I'll get pretty close to the look and the feel of the Norman Rockwell painting, but for instance, I have this one called April Fools, and the two subjects in it are playing games at a table, and in the original Norman Rockwell, it's an older couple, and they're playing chess, and they're in a room, there's a fireplace, and there's a stairwell, and things like that. But what's so interesting and fun about it is in Norman Rockwell's version, everything is painted wrong. There's things floating and perspectives are funny and things you wouldn't expect. Like I think the man is wearing ice skates or something. In the stair area, there's fish going up the stairs, or there's a zebra or something. And so I did lots of those kinds of similar things. And my version, it definitely feels like the same thing. So it was a lot of fun, and I called it April Fools. I believe that had something similar with the title in the Norman Rockwell version, but it was a lot of fun to paint. So that's another style of portraiture that I do. So when a client calls me, if they don't already know what they want and they just know that they want a portrait, then a lot of times I will send them to my website. And that way they can see the different styles, because I have on my website, shelleyjcox.com, I have many of the portraits that I have done in the past that I were asked permission to keep them on the website to show as a portfolio. Not that they're for sale or anything, because most people don't want to buy portraits of strange people that they don't know. And that way people can see my style, how I paint, and what my portraits can look like. All right, I'm getting into a little bit more with the female figure's head and placement now, and I'm going to be using that same vertical grid line that goes right in front of the center of the male figure's head. That's a good concrete anchor point. I know that whatever I measure from that center line is going to keep the two heads kind of working together and making sense within the composition. I am really liking the fact that his gaze is directly at the viewer while hers is off into the distance. I'd be curious to see if you guys have different thoughts on whether or not they should have both been looking into the distance or both been looking at the viewer. I just find it lends itself to the story to have two different directional gazes. Now, a lot of times when you're doing the photo shoot, that's something that you may want to pay more attention to than not, because whether or not the subject is looking directly at the viewer can make or break a portrait. It's important that you understand why you want someone in the portrait to look in a certain direction. You can see here how I have really just kept everything kind of general as far as inside the face with the features. I'm not worried about a strong likeness just yet. Still getting all of the other elements of the composition down before I can really get back into the faces. Look for the light and dark shapes. Shapes are what it's all about at this point. We're really kind of just tiling together the two bodies into the composition. In fact, if you can turn your brain off and tell your brain, you're not painting people, I'm not painting features, I'm not painting anything. I'm capturing light on the canvas. I'm painting the effects of light. I'm painting shapes. And if I put the shape in the right size and place on the canvas, and then if I go one step further and put it into the right value, then at the end, when I step back, I'm going to have a beautifully composed portrait underpainting. I'm using my favorite brushes right now. It's by Trekell. It's the Legion 9100. It's a long flat. And I find that these are soft enough to give me a beautiful effect in this kind of situation where I'm pushing paint around in kind of an oily surface. I'm not really painting so much as I am just pushing paint around, truly. It's like anywhere that you want a light shape to be, it's kind of like you just kind of push and work the paint out to where the edge of that light shape is, and then that makes the light shape. Now, anywhere that's dark, I'm just using a bigger, softer brush and just kind of pulling some of the paint into that area and then softening the transition as it moves to a more mid value, and then softening that transition as it moves to a more light value plane. It's different than actual painting where I just lay a brushstroke down and then leave it. I don't mess with it. This is different in the fact that you have to continuously kind of work over one area in order to move enough of the paint around if you're in a light shape, or you go quickly in an area that's darker. Like right here, we're just going to kind of lay that down in the hair, that dark shape, and then leave it. I don't need to go back over that because the paint was exactly where it needed to be and it was the right value. But in the areas where paint is needing to be moved, you just have to kind of push it with the brush, and you'll see what I mean if you're working on top of the walnut oil. I imagine, I don't work in watercolor. I have a long time ago, but I think it was kind of like that, like as if you're working with watered down paint and you're just kind of pushing things where you want them to be. So this is going to be a small face for me. It's typically not the size faces that I prefer to paint. I like to paint like a 5 to 8 inch face. However, these are probably more like 2 to 3 inches. So I'm going to be relying on some of the previous paintings that I've done where I was practicing putting down just enough information to get the likeness of a small face. I think this is going to work out pretty well. I feel like even though we haven't gone in for any distinct likeness yet, I feel like things are going to fall into place fairly easily. Now when it comes to the hands in my underpaintings, I like to kind of just draw them with line. I'm not worried about putting too much value and transitional shading in on the hand. Maybe just a little bit to show a significant plane change or shadow. But for the most part, my hands are going to be line drawings. Underpaintings are just that. They are basically drawings with paint. It's not like drawing with pencil or charcoal where, you're having to pay more attention to kind of the texture and the shading and the way that you're moving the pencil. With the paintbrush in this situation, it's more forgiving. And it also, I feel like it prepares you mentally to use the brush, and then when you're going back over it with color, you've almost done a sort of dress rehearsal in applying the paint, even though it's done differently because you're working with such loose, oiled down paint. It's still kind of getting you in the right mindset to work with the brush as opposed to a pencil. All right, we're going to be getting into some of the likenesses now. I, for some reason, didn't film fully the getting of the likeness for the female figure. You can see here she's pretty much nailed down, and now I'm going in and getting the male subject's likeness. All right, we're about 4 hours into the painting process now. Okay, remember, if you step away for a break, when you come back and you need to readjust the zoom, make sure you've written it down and you can zoom in to your reference image exactly where you were when you began the underpainting. That way you're still working with one-to-one measuring. I've popped up the reference image, kind of zoomed in here because we're working on the face of the male subject. So I wanted you to be able to see that what I'm doing is lending itself and moving itself towards capturing this likeness. Now, being that it is a commissioned portrait, it must, 100% must, look like the subjects. So if it were not a commissioned portrait, I wouldn't be as concerned with capturing the likeness. Sometimes when I'm doing some of my figurative work that's not commissioned portraiture, I don't worry about getting the likeness of the model. In fact, oftentimes I try to deviate from the exact likeness of the model just to make it a little bit more my own thing, I guess you could say. When you go on these photo shoots, sometimes the Western photo shoots especially, there are a lot of other artists there shooting similar scenes and definitely some of the same models. So it may be something that is a good idea to not worry about a likeness in that situation. You can see from the photo shoot the way I had the light set up with it coming in from the upper left side. It's giving us a really beautiful Rembrandt style lighting, which is great for this style of portraiture, giving this sort of old world feel to it. I am going to follow along with that shadow pattern so that I get that little triangle of light on the right side of the face and keep the left side of the face in the light. Now remember that halftones occur in the light planes. That means that anything that is not in shadow must be in a light plane, and you're going to make the transition of going from light to mid value to dark. You're going to make those transitions soft, and that way when you're adding color in later, there's not hard lines dividing those transitional areas. So just like when I do my larger portrait heads, I like to measure the eyes, comparing them to one another. So you saw I really worked out the size and shape of that eye on the left side of the head, and then I was able to compare it to the eye that I'm now working on the right side. I measured with the proportion tool the distance between the eyes, tear duct to tear duct. That's an important measure to get correct. And then a lot of times from there, I'll measure things like the inside of the iris to the inside of the iris on the other side. And then I'll go from the outside of the iris to the outside of the other iris. And I just keep measuring things against that initial eye that I put down. You use that initial eye kind of as an anchor point. So something that I'm thinking about while I'm painting this underpainting is I'm not worried about putting down anything incredibly dark. My darkest value is probably going to be like a 7, maybe an 8. And then my lightest value is probably going to be, let's say, a 3, maybe a 2. This is helpful because when you get to adding in the color and working on the final passes of the portrait, that's when you can push the contrast. If I went in and made everything really dark or really light initially, then it would kind of get in the way of me putting down the contrast with the color and kind of defining it when I get into the color and the color value. I want to leave room, I guess, in other words. Maybe I don't want an area to be as dark as I think I want it to be, so I'm not going to go in heavily and super dark in the underpainting. This way I have still some creative freedom when I'm laying down the color. The other reason is if you're working from photo references, they will make the darks in the painting darker than what they were actually looking like in real life. And they will do the opposite to the highlight areas or the light areas. They will make those appear lighter in the photo than what they were actually looking like in real life. So as you are laying down values, you want to keep that in mind when you're working with photo references. I really believe that the underpainting, if done correctly, and to the level of detail and finish that an underpainting, I believe, really should have, you could hang it on the wall as a finished piece. That's the goal. I know that I've done a really good underpainting when I finish and I look at it and I'm like, yeah, I could hang that on the wall right there as it is without even adding any color. That's the level of detail you want. If you don't have that level of detail, then you're going to have to continue to build the detail when you start getting into adding the color, which is fine if you want to go in that direction. But I like to have all of the drawing details pretty well hammered out before I start working with color. Another great object to use for wiping back to white or lighter areas is a kneaded eraser. That helps remove paint in very specific shapes or in small areas, like the catchlight in the eye or jewelry, things like that. Buckle, I have a buckle here on this, I think it's holding his sword. And there's also some little beads and things along the front sides of the hair. So I'm using the kneaded eraser to wipe back to white there. I've seen some tools that look like rubber spatulas. I would love to try that. I don't have one, but I think I would like to get that. I think that would work really well in moving some of this wet, slippery paint around. If you are working through the likeness and you feel like maybe you've worked on it for a few hours, several hours, and it's not happening, you just can't seem to nail the likeness. One of the things that you could do if you have just enough savvy on Photoshop or maybe Procreate, I don't know if there's other software that you can do it in, maybe there is. What you can do is you take a photograph of your underpainting, put it in Photoshop, and then bring the reference image in, and now zoom in or out of the reference photo and pull it right on top of your underpainting. So now you have two layers. The bottom layer is your underpainting, the top layer is the photographic reference. You want to make the photo reference slightly transparent. Decrease the opacity, in other words. That way you can see the underpainting underneath it somewhat. And you can now anchor. I like to usually anchor one of the eyes. In this case, I would probably anchor the eye on the left. So I would make sure that the pupil iris of the eye and the left socket are exactly the same. And then I would add another layer in the layers bar, and I would trace the photographic reference. Pull it back up to 100% opacity, trace over the photographic reference, and then turn off the eye in the layer of the photo reference so that you now see your drawing, the correct drawing, on top of your underpainting. And now you will absolutely, without 100% doubt, see where you are off and where you need to correct in order to nail that likeness. One of the areas that I find extremely important to get right in order to have a good likeness is the eyebrows. You wouldn't think that eyebrows would matter so much, but they do. If you can't get the shape correct, the likeness will suffer. So take your time and really look at your photo reference. I find that if people are new, especially to portrait painting, they don't spend enough time really looking at the photo reference. You've got to take, a really good long look at it, a really good hard look at it. Maybe if you can have it on a computer monitor, zoom in like 200%, 300%, and really blow it up so that maybe the only thing you're looking at is that eyebrow. Maybe it's one eyebrow, but you're really examining the angle of it. How much of a tail on the far end of the eyebrow is there? Are the eyebrows thick? Is the hair dense? Is the hair sparse? I mean, really ask yourself questions and understand what it is you're looking at in your photo reference. And you want to do that for the other features as well. A lot of times, the shape of someone's eye. And the thing to really pay attention to in nailing the likeness with the eyes, I believe, is the white of the eye, the negative shape, in other words. Yes, you put the pupil down, but how much of the white of the eye do you see going towards the tear duct? How much of the white of the eye do you see going towards the outer corner? What is the angle and shape of the two negative or white of the eye shapes? The other thing to pay attention to on eyes is the angle of the outer corner compared to the position of the tear duct. A lot of times the outer corners will angle up slightly, especially if it's a forward-facing view. Sometimes in the 3/4 view, you'll get that in different degrees, but for the most part, the outer corner of the eye and the tear duct, they typically don't line up. Maybe on a rare occasion they will, but for the most part, they don't. So you want to ask yourself, where does the outer corner of the eye lie in comparison to the tear duct? And look at each eye individually. You will notice with the beard and the mustache, I'm not painting individual hairs. I'm basically just putting in large shapes and kind of massing what I see as far as the position on the face. And then I'm transitioning from the edge of the hair, the facial hair, to where it meets the skin. Those are the areas where things are going to be a little soft or blurry. But for the most part, I'm not putting in any individual hair. What I am looking at are, where are the shadow planes? Those are the really important planes and shapes to get correct, are the shadow shapes. For instance, we know the light's coming in from the top left, therefore there's going to be shadows cast under the bottom plane of the hat, under the nose, to the right side plane of the nose, and the right side plane of the face, and a little bit under the chin, which is kind of blocked by the beard, but that means that that under plane of the beard is also going to be in shadow. The other thing I'm looking for are lost and found edges. I want to pay attention to edges in the underpainting so that I don't have to think about that too much when I'm adding color. I've kind of decided in the underpainting where I'm going to have certain edges falling. For instance, the shoulder on the right as compared to the background, they're very similar or very close in value. There's not a lot of contrast there. And that is going to be one of the edges where things could be potentially lost, or at least kind of broken or softened. So we're about 6 hours into the painting now. We're coming close to getting the likeness. I feel like she's down pretty good and he's still getting there. He's really close though, but you want to make sure that it's exact. Like I said, this is going to stay wet for quite some time, several days in fact, so there's no reason to rush. It's just like when you're putting down color and you've completed that first pass over the face, then it's time to go back. Go back for a second pass and really look at, are the shapes and the features painted well? Are the transitions from light plane to shadow planes painted well. Again, think about the edges. Within a portrait, you do want to see a variety of edges. If you are the type of painter who ends up with all hard edges when it's all done and said, then now, before the underpainting dries, is the time to go back and correct that. You definitely want to have a variety of edges. But I'm going to really take my time and go back over the entire face and make sure that I have a solid likeness. One of the things that has helped me the most in my journey to becoming the portrait painter that I want to be is mentoring and mentorships. Having someone to ask questions to and get help on the projects that you're working on. If you think that having a mentor in your corner would help you develop your skills to a higher level and get you to reach the level of portraiture and portrait painting artist that you want to be, you can check me out at sjcportraitcourse.com. I have different levels of mentorship that I offer and critiques and critique packages. So you can go there and check that out. Maybe that's something that could help you along the way. I find that, taking courses and attending workshops, those are great too. Definitely do that as well. But when you're in the studio and you're working on a piece and you don't often know what you don't know, so you can't even ask the question or get help because you just don't even know that you need it. And that's what was happening with me. So it wasn't until I had my mentor, Tina Garrett, and she was able to see the work that I was doing, and she's like, okay, this is what's working so far in your skill level, and these are the things that you need to work on in order to lift your skill level to a more professional place and be able to, become the painter that I am hoping to be. And, when I would be working on something, I could email her or, show her the picture of the painting on our meeting days, and she would help me improve where I was at that very moment. It was really a different thing other than, learning skills at a workshop. I can't really explain to you how important it was for me to have a great mentor like her on my side. So you can definitely check out my mentorship and critique packages on my website. Again, that's sjcportraitcourse.com. There's information on that also in the description of this video. Now that I have the likeness down in both my figures, I'm going to go ahead and finish up getting down the composition. But I'm going to keep in mind that the focal point is the two faces. That's where I want people to look, predominantly, or at least first when they come upon the painting initially. So the way that happens is you want to have the majority of the detail and the contrast happening in the face. That's where you want, hard edges, darks against lights, and really a lot of contrast. That will definitely pull a viewer's eye to an area in a painting. And that also can be pushed along by keeping everything sort of soft and kind of disappearing, if you will, as you move out towards the edges of the painting. Things get softer, less detailed, less saturated in color. So when you're getting into the color area, remember you don't want anything too saturated off towards the background or in the edges. You want to keep all of the cool punches, the saturation, the contrast, the edgy brushwork, anything that's going to really draw the eye of the viewer. You want to keep that in or around the face of your subjects. You can see here how the grid lines in the background are just simply wiped away as you build and work the rest of the body and the figure's legs and shoes and different accessories down and towards the bottom. I had grid lines up until the very end that I was using, and as I finished the portrait, then I just went back over with a large soft brush and blended the grid lines away. Something to think about while I'm finishing up my underpainting is how will I begin adding color once it's dry? Meaning, in other words, will I begin by adding paint to the background? Will I begin by jumping into adding color to a face? Will I begin on the body with the clothing? I think with this one, I'm leaning towards starting with the background. Now, every portrait or every painting has its own challenges and its own kind of pathway that happens. I don't seem to be able to paint every painting the same way. Sometimes I go in after the underpainting to the background. Sometimes I go into the face. So there's never one specific way of doing a painting. And I think I want to go in with a darker background so that it really helps me see how light I need to go in some of the lights where the whites of the shirts are, the light, the white of the eye, any of the lighter areas. I can't truly be certain about their value, even though it's going to be color value, I feel, unless I have down the value of how dark I want that background to be. Now, it doesn't mean that once I get the background in place as far as how dark or light it is, that I can't change it. I just need somewhere to go. And I feel like the underpainting background as it stands is still a bit lighter than I want it to be in the final painting. So I feel like that's probably going to be the place that I begin when I'm adding the color. Another thing to think about is when you're painting the underpainting, how developed do you want the shadow areas to be? Are you going to let your underpainting stand alone in the shadow areas? That's something that was done quite often in Rembrandt's day, let's say. A lot of the old masters would let the underpainting in the shadow areas be what you saw in the final painting. They didn't really do a lot of painting over those areas. So if you can develop your shadow areas in the underpainting to a level of finish that you like for the actual finished portrait, then you may not want to paint over those shadow areas when you're adding color. Another thing I like to do in the underpainting is add interesting textures and brush marks. Even when I am doing the underpainting, I'm thinking about mark making. How can I make a certain mark in order to describe the texture of the thing I'm painting? And there's a lot of great textures here. We have leather on their boots. We have sort of a suede effect on the hat. There is tapestries, there's more smooth like in textures in the cotton, and then of course the smoothness of skin versus the texture of hair in the male's face. So there's a lot of different textures and surfaces happening in the reference, and I can make note and try to capture some of that by how I lay down marks. You will continue thinking about mark making even during the color application. In fact, I remember one instructor that I was at a workshop with, they would refer to some of those final brush strokes as the money strokes, the money brush strokes. You put those down like you would imagine John Singer Sargent with a bravura, and you just make a mark with absolute certainty. It goes down and you leave it, you don't touch it. Those are the kinds of marks you want to see throughout a painting. Only a few though. They're like spices when you're cooking. You don't want to overdo them. Kind of like with the highlights. You want to have just the right amount of highlight, just the right amount of really interesting brush strokes so that the painting just sings. So one of the things that I often say to my students that I work with is during the underpainting time, do not rush it. You don't have to paint the underpainting quickly. Take your time. That is the number one most important thing when it comes to an underpainting. You're not done with the underpainting until it's perfect, I mean, truly nailed as far as, if it's a commission portrait especially, or you're trying to get a likeness. Once you have it, then you can let it dry and move on. But take your time. There are no awards for painting quickly. Trust me, I've checked. But here we are, the final underpainting. So guys, stay tuned for part 3 where I will be adding color on top. Thanks. See you in the next one.